Welcome to Wavemaker Conversations. I'm Michael Schulder, and my guest in this episode is one of the leading cybersecurity experts in the United States. Her name is Laura Galante. And the reason I reached out to her, if you've been following the news about cybersecurity and AI, it really has to do with the headlines from this past month from Anthropic, the AI giant, and its new tool or model called Claude Mythos. Which Anthropic has said is so powerful at uncovering literally thousands of vulnerabilities within every computer operating system, it's not even releasing it to the public. It's just too dangerous to risk getting it into the wrong hands. There have been a lot of headlines about this. For those of you watching this, we're going to put it up on the screen. You'll take a look. It's a really important story to follow. And Laura Galante is one of the best people to walk us through it and also to give us a broader perspective because she has been in this business of cybersecurity for about 20 years. From 2022 to 2025, Laura served as the director of the U.S. government's Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. She coordinated the intelligence community's response to national cyber incidents, shutting down hospital systems, threatening electricity systems, all the things we rely on day to day. She was on top of that. She represented the intelligence community on National Security Council policy committees, which often met in the Situation Room, in the White House Situation Room. Before that, she spent several years consulting on cyber intelligence operations with the government of Ukraine. We're going to talk about that. She currently is a principal at the strategic advisory firm called West Exec Advisors. In addition to being a cybersecurity consultant, Laura runs a family farm, which I think is a fantastic combination. One more thing, I've asked Laura to discuss an episode from my very favorite show these days, The Pit. Some of you might know it and be addicted to it like I am. The Pit is about a fictional emergency room in Pittsburgh. I think it's often hyper-real. We're going to get a reality check from her on a really important cyber theme in season 2. Those of you who have watched it know what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't watched it will give you enough background to understand why it's so important to get a reality check on this. So, moving forward, I hope you enjoy what I think is an enlightening and perspective-changing conversation from our guest, Laura Galante. Laura Galante, welcome to Wavemaker Conversations.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Great to be here.
My first question to you is everything you knew in 2025 now outdated, or is it still the right foundation to have?
So I've been in cyber intelligence in the public and private sector, as you mentioned here, since the beginning of my career, so now almost 20 years. And when I think about the threads that have remained constant through that time period, which is roughly tracking our understanding of how the internet became a malicious domain, became an attack surface, right? I think of two sort of evergreen factors. One is the actors who have been most capable in operating on the internet, in the cyber domain, for good and for bad. And I'll walk through those in a second. And then the other constant has been attackers and the adversary's ability to adopt new technology and deploy it faster than defenders. And you're always in a bit of cat and mouse when you think cybersecurity, particularly in the US, because the amount of digital hackable devices from when I started in this 2008, 2009 to today is wildly different. And there's a scaling factor that's happened through the different phases of technological breakthroughs as companies have gone online and now with AI. So I'm sure we'll get into that, but it's wildly consistent about who has been active in cyberspace, militaries and governments, and who those are. And then it's wildly consistent that the rate of change has defined how attackers have exploited and operated in the domain.
So going back, just for a quick historical perspective, 2008, you remember you got into the field. What was the biggest and most complicated threat you had to deal with? And then we'll fast forward to today.
So 2008, sort of late aughts, there were major discussions around what China was doing in cyberspace. And then there was a question because Russia had put out this doctrine, sort of a signal from a military standpoint about how they would use the internet. But the ability to see proof points of what that looked like, to actually understand where they were hitting and what they were hitting, was a big open question. And Russia and China were the defining two militaries and intelligence operators in cyber, in the domain. And one of the first and one of my kind of vivid memories, and everyone who sort of cut their teeth at that time period remembers, is there were these Chinese military parades. And you would see a version of a US fighter jet like the F-35 headed down the street in Beijing. And you would look at it and say, boy, does that look way too similar to an F-35. And you had other proof points like this, too, that were just sort of showing up. And the question was, is this IT problem that we have at the Boeings of the world, at the defense industrial base companies, somehow linked to what we're seeing show up as military capability in China? And it now seems almost quaint. This is almost 20 years ago. But the ability to draw the forensic line from a bad day in an IT department to the operationalization of intellectual property theft into state-owned enterprises and then the military capabilities in China took intelligence analysis, and it took years of understanding how that chain of custody, if you will, was working and where that was really undercutting not just U.S. military abilities, but also major intellectual property across Fortune 500.
So you mentioned that chain of custody, and one of your areas of expertise, I think there's a term of art for it. It's finding that
Attribution.
Thank you.
Who was behind the activity?
Who was behind it? Attribution, which in journalism is sort of it's straightforward. It's like, who did you learn that from, and can you trust that person? For your field, attribution is invisible until you find out where to shine the light.
The concept of this cloak of invisibility, if you'll permit me the Harry Potter reference, is one where in the early days of understanding our cyber adversaries, there was this sense that it would be really, really hard, and it was, to be able to track the different forensic artifacts that you would see on a network and then understand what else would lead you back to the people behind this activity. This wasn't just some automated, scam and botnets. Like, people are operating the infrastructure on the internet that is used in cyber operations. But what's happened is over time, there have been methods and there's been a discipline that has evolved on how you research the evidence on the internet and the registration, the bits and bytes that go into being able to stage a scaled attack, and then combine that in a rigorous way. And this comes from the intelligence discipline within the intelligence community the last 50 some years. And there's a lot of parallels to journalism here as well, but understanding the analytic techniques that you can use to put that data together and then see what else is relevant. And through that development of a process over the last 15, 20 years, we're now at a place where attribution isn't necessarily easy, but it's something where you can understand the states and the types of criminal activity that is hitting networks. And in that sense of attribution being a key logjam in knowing what to do about a cyber attack is now, it functions as a much smaller part of the difficulty in how we look at cyber operations.
So recently I was reading in the Financial Times, I'm looking for the article, it was a major Chinese cyber hack. And the way it was discovered, it might have been ongoing, you might know about it. The way it was discovered, they realized that whatever these bots were doing, whenever they were doing it, it happened to coincide with the Chinese workday. Do you know what I'm referring to?
This is a long time pattern of behavior that we've seen out of state actors, but particularly out of the Chinese military and intelligence services. I remember back in 2010, 2011, one of the factors that was useful in understanding how much intellectual property theft Chinese operations were stealing is that the break in operations against US companies overlaid with Golden Week in China, which is essentially the winter break, typically it's wintertime, when the Chinese military and everyone else in government was out of the office. And it was almost a running joke before people understood how this all was put together, but it was like there will not be attacks during Golden Week. So the human factor behind this is incredibly important to understand.
And that's incredible so now they know that we know, but have their habits changed at all?
Very much so. I mean, the behavior and the way that you would see adversaries operate in a world where they thought they were invisible was so different than where you are today. I remember a time when developers, the guys writing the code for an attack, would leave signatures intentionally because they were so proud of the code they had written. Those were the kind of easy artifacts to put together to say who's behind this. But to even consider that would be, something you would do today is wild. So one of the signatures that, vividly everyone remembers was called Ugly Gorilla. And it was a PLA, it was a Chinese military officer's signature that he would put in code. And back in the day when a lot of this was first exposed, even these handles, these names that were used in the signature and code were part of what was exposed to show the level of depth and understanding around who these actors were. And when the Chinese government reacted to a lot of these initial exposures, they basically have been blanket denials that China hacks and that the government's behind this. And that is typically the running phraseology that China uses publicly when they're accused of attacks. But it became so specific that it was hard to deny. And that was very much, I think, a moment where militaries and intelligence agencies said, if we're going to get caught, we need a different way to operate. We need to think about how we retool. What do we use? How do we make this a more diverse set of capabilities? So it's not just, one unit in China. It's not just one part of the GRU, the Russian military, that's doing this, and really spread this across different capabilities and people.
So now let's get up to the sort of ongoing breaking news from the past couple of weeks. And you talk about, it's not just one unit. We don't want to give that impression. So let me read you the headline. One of my favorite journalists on this subject, Mateo Wong in The Atlantic. So I find he explains things very clearly. So he wrote in early April, for the past several weeks, Anthropic, one of the big ones, one of the big AI companies, says it secretly possessed a tool potentially capable of commandeering most computer servers in the world. The news audience has seen this story, but I'm just going to read a few details and then go to you. This is a bot that, if unleashed, might be able to hack into banks, exfiltrate state secrets, and fry crucial infrastructure. Already, according to the company, this AI model has identified thousands of major cybersecurity vulnerabilities, including exploits in every single major operating system and browser, typically only available to elite institutions, to countries like China, Russia, and the US. Now it was in the hands of a private company. So this is called Claude Mythos Preview. And then I know we were in touch on that, and just a couple of days later that you said, yep, now OpenAI claims it's basically matched Claude Mythos Preview. And Claude Mythos Preview is only going into the hands at the moment of a small group of companies. OpenAI says its version is some of it it's holding back, but it's going to distribute it more widely. And so there was a quote from a guy who talked about recently AI orchestrated threats, Giovanni Vigna. You can have 1 million hackers at your fingertips with the push of a button. So getting to your point about attribution, the difficulty of attribution, or the increasing difficulty of it. I mean, tell me how you deal with that. And tell me, when you look at it from your perspective as somebody who has been in the Situation Room dealing with these issues, the White House Situation Room, when you got the news of this new Claude Mythos Preview and the OpenAI equivalent, what was your first reaction? What did you think?
Let's step back for a second on what the development over the last couple months has been, because it's both ground shifting from a defender standpoint and from an attacker's standpoint. And I think there's been a lot of coverage around what this means potentially for attackers, but it is not an easy button for hacking everything. Just, not to make you sleep better at night, but it's not quite that simple, right? And I do think that there is an urgency that is getting captured in this moment for defenders who are in charge of these systems all over the world, that they've got a moment to act here and a time period to act in the next 30 to 90 days that is sort of unprecedented. And they have the attention of their board and everyone else that they need to ask for resources from to really clean up the basic security of their networks that they're working through in their products. So, okay, what is Mythos? What is this moment? So the two of the major frontier models, OpenAI's and Anthropic's, have both now publicly said that their model has significantly increased the likelihood that an attacker can discover new vulnerabilities and then exploit them at scale. And you mentioned the word exfiltration. When you think about the attack life cycle for a cyber attack, it starts with reconnaissance, figure out what you're attacking, how to get in. And then it ends with some sort of event like exfiltration, taking data out, taking something about the network away, or causing an effect, disrupting the network. So that entire life cycle of a cyber attack is now within the capability of these new models that are being released. That's the aha moment that is really changing how security practitioners are thinking about how they take the programs that they've built and the defensive measures that they've been working on, and then supercharge them in a lot of ways by using AI, by using these agents that everyone's talking about, to go check for vulnerabilities in their own networks and figure out how to patch them before it's turned against them. That's the dynamic of the race that we're in right now.
And given how much sensitive technology that's developing as we speak is in the hands of private enterprise, we start thinking of the development of the atomic bomb and how much security there was around that. I mean, people couldn't get in and out. Richard Feynman, the physicist who helped develop that, has some very funny stories about him writing letters to his wife, who was outside Los Alamos, and making the censors believe he was writing in code just to mess with them because he had a good sense of humor. But here we are, where individual companies, in essence, have the tools that make them not as powerful as a government because they don't have the military behind them and other points of leverage, but they've got some huge leverage. Is anybody thinking maybe this should be under at least the partial control of the U.S. government?
One of the ways that I think the companies are trying to grapple with this, because they're not getting a whole lot of messaging from the government on what to do. One of the ways Anthropic and OpenAI are trying to thread the needle that you're talking about here is by saying, let's give this tool essentially access to the frontier model in a certain way to the people who are going to be able to most quickly use it to scale defensive measures across different parts of the internet. This is Project Glasswing in a sense of what Anthropic's trying to do. OpenAI has a trusted access program that they talked about last December to put this in the hands of people who can use it most. So that's the good and important attempt to try to clean up and give the tool to the people who can clean up most quickly and most effectively across different parts of the internet, right? But the government question here is the right one. And a lot of the debate right now is how do you give government intelligence agencies, Department of Defense, other parts of the US government, and then allies are going to be interested too, as are other governments. How do you give them an understanding and what are they asking for from these frontier companies so that they can understand how this plays out in the missions that they have to do to defend a nation, right? I think the conversation there has not caught up to where capability is. Surprise. In technology, government lags in asking for what they want, but that's really where we're headed. How does the government want to use this? How do they want to figure out the guardrails on how these companies operate?
So, looking at your background, I noticed that among other things, you were a point person dealing with our allies on this material. And I feel like right now, I want somebody to appoint you as the intermediary between the US government and the private companies to sort of figure out what are your critical interests, US government, what are your most critical interests, private enterprise, and figure out an answer to your question.
The moment for coordination between government agencies and the major technology companies and AI companies that are out there today could not be more pivotal. Like, this is the time. And you have essentially the largest vulnerability disclosure and patching activity in history. Not to not to overstate it, but that's what's going on. And at the same time, you don't have a director of the main cybersecurity agency in America, of CISA, under DHS. There have been various nominees, and right now there's no director for a bunch of different reasons in Congress.
So you were helping me sleep better just like about 5 minutes ago. But the fact that there's nobody coordinating that makes me nervous.
There's a lot of different ways that you can go about government interaction with the private sector. This administration has as did the last, has a chief cyber director in the Office of the National Cyber Director in the White House. So in principle, there's that person. But over the last 10, 15 years, the number of agencies from NSA, the National Security Agency, to CISA under DHS, all of these different agencies have authorities for the coordination work that's critical here. And one of the widely discussed but maybe underappreciated elements that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years is you have a cybersecurity industry in the US that is in many ways populated by people who grew up in government mission roles in cybersecurity or were close to the ecosystem around how the government built out cybersecurity. And now they have that same, in a lot of ways, shared sense of duty and mission around how do you protect the systems that everyone's lives depend on and the economy depends on. And then you have a government side that has to be able to coordinate and match some of that activity, but also drive and say, these are the most critical places where we need people to focus, or these are the sorts of programs where we're going to be able to bring top minds together in a shared setting, in a small setting, and go off and do hard problems, right? And that's the duality that you want to be able to protect what is a massively large privately owned surface, the internet. And there's a lot of room to grow.
That's very clear. And, I still come back to, you talk about this opportunity, this moment, and you said during the next 30 to 90 days, and I can't get that period out of my head. This is not something we can sort of think about or create a committee about, although sometimes when situations are most urgent, you need to pause. Somebody once told me that, in the emergency room, that's something that people know to do. You have to just pause, even if it's for a moment, so that you don't rush into the wrong approach. Nevertheless, 30 to 90 days. So if you can just carve out the next 90 days, then I'll be in touch with you on a daily basis, and then we'll be fine. We're the ones who are going to do this. By the way, you are incredibly a farmer at this moment. Is that something that, you can't do that part-time on the farm, given that is a early morning to late night job? Do you ever have time to watch TV?
I'm not a big screen watcher, I have to say. In my farm, I certainly I probably spend more on it than I make. So I don't make my living off farming, but I do enjoy and have a decent sized flock of sheep here and horses and more. But I don't get a lot of screen time, which is actually the way I like it.
Well, you may like it that way, but I have to tell you, the screen time we often associate with social media and just, things that get you addicted and aren't very nourishing to the soul. This is The Pit. And it's, for those in the audience who have not watched The Pit, maybe have heard about it. It's set in a fictional emergency room that is extremely busy, which is not fictional, in Pittsburgh. And that's why it's called The Pit. And there was an important storyline for those of you who are just in the middle of season 2 and you don't want to see anything of this, then pause or fast forward, because I'm going to play you a clip from this storyline. And then I want Laura to see this and then react to it, because this is the first time I really felt in a visceral way what the impact of just one small successful cyber attack could be.
Our IT protection system has blocked thousands of intrusion attempts in the hours since Westbridge was hit this morning, but IT believes we're still vulnerable. So we're going to preemptively shut down all the computer systems.
Okay, hey, somebody get a picture of the board. Quickly, quickly. We're about to go analog.
Phones work? They don't work.
This is gonna be fun.
So I think this dramatization is pretty close to how a lot of hospitals have felt over the last few years as emergency responders, hospital networks, and other parts of the health system have been ruthlessly attacked, especially by cyber criminals. So not state-backed hacking groups, but criminal networks. And let me pause on that for a second, because in 2022, 2023, one of the things that cyber criminals figured out is that companies and entities that value operational time, obviously like a hospital, are the most likely to pay the extortion, the ransom, that they are getting asked to pay if their network gets locked up by a hacker. Talk about an awful calculation, but essentially Russian-based cyber criminals saw that window and said, these guys pay. And the amount of attacks that specifically went at the health sector just totally rose. And the 2024 attack on Change Healthcare is one that I remember from my government seat, but I think everyone who tracked cyber operations remembers when they started hearing that people couldn't get the prescriptions and it was somehow linked to a cyber attack. And that was one of these moments where this wasn't IT's going down. I know they quickly capture it in the Pit episode there, calling it IT's going down. This was the operational backbone of the U.S. health system, was delaying payments and care coordination and all of the financial architecture, if you will, that make hospitals and care go, and physicians out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, truly everybody was affected by the ransomware attack on Change Healthcare in 2024. And this moved from a cybersecurity matters to our board to we have to have an operational plan, not for an episode, not for a one-time network blip where we're going to preemptively take down a network, to paraphrase from the Pit. But no, we have to be able to figure out how to operate through uncertainty. We have to have a plan that's about resilience instead of about what we call in cybersecurity remediation. This isn't clean up a network and then figure it out and reboot over the weekend. This is how do you operate through a contested system, through a contested environment. So that shift in thinking is a couple years old in practice here, but is one that art, if you will, and Hollywood hasn't quite caught up to. And the episodic, everything's going down, it crystallizes the moment. But smart organizations have said we can't afford the moment you just saw in the Pit. We need to have a better approach to what operations stay online no matter what. We have to figure out what systems don't touch the internet. We've got to figure out what stays segmented from what. We can't afford to have everything go down like you saw there. So that's a little bit of the nuance on how organizations have tried to manage a moment like that.
And it's interesting because that scene or the next episode goes on to show that they were trained in going totally analog. It became all paper, which caused innumerable delays for patients who had critical conditions, but somehow they made it work. Could they have sustained it for more than the 10 hours or a couple of hours that it lasted? I don't know. But you said something that it's a really a meaning of life observation that's bouncing off this. You said companies, the government, I guess, as well, has to learn how to operate through uncertainty. And I mean, that's life. There's always a level of uncertainty. This is obviously talking about extreme uncertainty. Corporations and others have to get smarter about deciding which systems go down, which systems can stay up. I did not know about that Change Healthcare story. Was that like a front page story that I missed?
It was huge in cybersecurity world, but I think it did really come through. It was February 2024. A lot of the reason why it was so easy to get into healthcare systems and to get into healthcare companies is, as wild as this is, COVID was the activator to get the last line, the last mile of a lot of these different health enterprises online. And that's the case for K through 12 and a lot of the education systems too. It wasn't just online learning. It was everything that you needed to be able to do when you couldn't get people in person. And when you have that quick migration to get online, that's where you've got a lot of security shortcuts that people took or they didn't do. And that created a lot of the opening that you had for the span of attacks in healthcare.
That's again, I guess, at that time, there were so many big things on our plate.
Especially for healthcare.
And it all felt existential.
Right.
No time to pause. If it had been maybe a slightly more normal time, but I'm not even sure if I can, sometimes it's our failure of imagination that enables a horrible, horrible thing to happen. I don't know, what role does imagination play in not only our cyber defenses, but using cyber to shape the world and shape the battlefield as well, both literally and figuratively? You've been in the Situation Room. Is there a case that you can relay to me where human imagination actually helped determine which way an incident ended up going?
One of the places where I think it almost becomes a shorthand of too big to secure, to play off the old too big to fail from the banking failures days, is around certain systems in the US that have either been hacked so many times or seen as so vulnerable or below what some people will call the cyber poverty line. Okay, for example, water systems or education systems, sort of verticals, industry verticals or entities that don't really have the same security resources that the banks do, for example, right? And I think the failure of imagination, if I can kind of extend that, is there's this sense of they will be the ones that the bear eats because everyone else can outrun the bear and secure their networks. And these guys are kind of the sad sort of like these networks are going to get hit. We'll clean them up. Someone will clean them up when you get to it. But what if you were, and I think this moment is arriving in cybersecurity circles, what if you were to think differently about this and say, how do you take the moment around defender's advantage that you have with the AI models that are coming out right now and say, let's go at the systems that are least well defended and play the largest role in people's lives, not just the economic well-being. Like the banks and the financial sector's got this to some degree, but how do we go at these organizations under the cyber poverty line and really put in an effort almost like a national, think back to an FDR moment and say, let's go clean up the low-hanging fruit that is the quiet vulnerability and underbelly to how Americans function every day, and really focus on cleaning that with the tools that are available. That to me would be the turn on this, to say our problem is not it's too big to secure the American critical infrastructure sectors. It's that we have failed to imagine what security can look like for the organizations that are running our daily lives.
And to the organizations that are running our daily lives that you're referring to, does that ever get to the level of the Situation Room?
So after October 7th, when Israel had been attacked, and Iran was looking for ways to test their involvement in a broader regional conflict, the first way that we saw Iran engage was through a set of cyber attacks on water systems in the US and in Israel. And the way they did it, it was the IRGC, so it was the Iranian military. The way that they did it was by hacking into a controller that was an Israeli-made controller for water systems. And there were plants all over the US, everything from dairies to food to water and wastewater systems themselves, that used this type of controller. And what the Iranian hackers were able to do was essentially black screen, but just wipe out the use of these controllers. And as a result, a lot of different systems across the states were wiped out, and people had to operate either completely manually or figure out how to reset their whole system. It wasn't the sort of thing that was a cyber 9/11, but it was incredibly impactful on a physical level. But what this did is it crossed this Rubicon for how states are going to test and use cyber to physical means to have a physical disruption that is visual, that affects people's lives. It's water, right? And I think that is the type of thing where you had water operators who probably didn't have a cybersecurity guy, or they had a few cybersecurity folks. And there's, 50 to 70,000 different water systems in this country. So incredibly diffused, hard to help everybody. But those are the types of industries and places where if you can't get water for 3 days in even a small city or town, that starts becoming a political lever. It starts changing the decision calculus for how the government acts. It starts becoming a real crisis. So those are the sorts of places where you have to look and say, how do we clean up the defenses? How do we create a more resilient posture around assets like that haven't gotten the same level of attention for cybersecurity?
Oh, that's fascinating. Our mind is really on, obviously, the war in Iran right now, and related issues. And in fact, I've got to get to, again, the Financial Times again, because 6 hours ago, in the Financial Times, Russia will hold its Victory Day parade without heavy military equipment for the first time in almost 2 decades, as Ukraine's intensifying long-range strikes threaten to overshadow Putin's showcase event. They're concerned that they can't have this kind of parade anymore because they're vulnerable to Ukraine, which has just, not overnight, but over the past 2 years, figured out how to become resilient enough to use technology, including AI, to actually hold off Russia. I even read somewhere that they're not winning this war is a war of attrition at this point. But the fact that they're still holding on to so much of their territory and even conquering some that had been conquered is sort of amazing to me. So tell us about Ukraine and the idea that this show of, we talk about asymmetric threats. And in some ways, that's the phrase that came to me when you talked about Iran, because Iran seemingly can't hurt us physically on our homeland with military equipment, maybe through terrorist attacks. But boy, cutting off the water supply is as terrifying in many ways, certainly it would be after a few days, than a specific military attack. So tell me about Ukraine and how does this fit into the whole idea of asymmetric threats and what it means now to be a great power versus a small power?
I started going to Ukraine in 2017, which at that time was 3 years after the original Russian invasion into parts of eastern Ukraine that had happened in 2014. And one of the very first impressions I had on the ground in Ukraine in 17 was this is a country that is operating with wartime posture. Their intelligence services, their militaries, and this is 5 years before the invasion in 2022 that I think really opened the world's eyes up to how aggressive Putin was, among other things. And what that footing has given Ukraine, which is an incredibly innovative, young, and thoughtful country, is problems, defensive problems, cyber problems, problems of modern warfare, where they had to take a asymmetric disadvantage in money, in weaponry, in training, in time, and figure out how to flip it so that they had the asymmetric advantage. And one of the pieces that I think makes it work in Ukraine, and this comes through a little bit in how Zelensky talks, I think, and how people perceive him, is you have a scrappy attitude. You have a we will make this work no matter what. And the famous line from the beginning of the reinvasion in 22, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. This is a country, these are people who deeply get that they are not just the front lines of a war where they have been outmatched. This is a war where they're sitting with the free world sense and Europe's sense, and to some degree America's sense of this is what you have to do to hold back a aging, throw the whole playbook and my whole military at them approach that Putin has had. And this is what good can look like. We have to drive that. And the way that the Ukrainians have figured out drone technology alone, but also even just changed how you do command and control, and a lot of the sort of military modernization principles that I think we'll see in the next 10, 15 years will be born out of how the Ukrainians have been able to keep their defenders' advantage and then drive a more offensive posture towards Putin.
Were you in government when they flipped it, when Ukraine flipped it? And was there a moment where people at the highest levels of government realized, boy, we thought they were going down? Was there a moment where there was a recognition they're flipping it, or they flipped it?
Not to a degree where you had a sense of this is, you're winning or losing a war, right? There's very rarely a moment like that. But let me tell you a little bit about that moment in February 2022 when the invasion and the reinvasion happened, because I think, it's easy to remember how Zelensky played it. It is hard to remember how absolutely terrifying it was. And there was a huge question of whether Putin was actually going to invade Ukraine or not. That was almost like, no one could figure out, are they joking? Are they not? And yet the intelligence was clearly saying they are about to do this. And you had this historic release of intelligence out of the community. And, I was sitting in government at the time where you would have reports of what the Russians were going to do out in the public to show this is real. And it was in that short window of time, over just a few weeks and even the couple days before February 25th, where you had this window to say, this is going to happen. The Ukrainians are not provoking it. Putin is trying to create pretenses to attack Ukraine. In that frame, in the world's mind, but particularly in Europe, I think changed the way that the Ukrainians saw the moment. It changed defense spending budgets quite tactically in Europe, that we're now seeing play out years later in a sustained level of defense spending that was needed. And you had this time where you were able to flip the narrative in this key moment to show Putin's the attacker, which he was. And you didn't let the Russians drive what was the narrative start to that war. And I think, even through what has been a hellish experience for the Ukrainians, that window at the beginning was really critical to set the terms of who the adversary was and is.
How much time did you spend there, by the way?
I went back and forth often between 17 and the end of 21, right before I went into government early 2022. So I'd only been in my old seat in government for a couple months when the invasion started.
So when you were going back and forth, was that for a private enterprise? Were you a consultant?
Yeah, I was working partially under USAID, which is now not an agency, but under the original USAID cyber money for Ukraine, working closely with the embassy and then with the Ukrainian government. And then I also had some other projects that I did through my own consultancy directly with Ukrainian groups and then think tanks as well on the ground in Kyiv.
And just on the ground in Kyiv at that time, clearly there were a lot of certainly young, brilliant tech minds, probably more brilliant now given their experience. General impressions at that time, and when that second invasion happened, given what you knew about your back and forth, was your sense that, you know what, they're scrappy and they're going to make it? Or, boy, I don't know. I mean, Russia has such an overwhelming force, and as I interviewed a Russia expert last year in Nantucket, Julia Yaffe.
Yeah.
And, she talks about how the experience of Stalin is, as we talked about, why aren't there any protests, right? And the experience of Stalin is in everybody's bloodstream, including the younger generation. And they know that if you come out and you demonstrate against this, you don't agree to go to the front, really, really terrible things could happen on a massive scale. So she said, Putin only has to make examples of really a couple of people and they get it. And it seems that we're in a situation now where, we hear about North Korean soldiers who've just been given orders apparently to kill yourself rather than be captured in the war against Ukraine. Given your experience with the Ukrainian people at the levels you were dealing with, did you have that sense that they are scrappy enough to survive this?
The ethos in Ukraine is incredibly strong, but you also have to have the power behind you. You have to have the military. You have to have the ability to defend yourself. This is not cheap, and that's the part that, no matter how much you can feel and understand that people are fighting for their country, their livelihood, their history, they also, like, the responsibility of the West, the responsibility of Europe, of free people, is also to help win that war. And that's the part where I get a little worried when people over-index on how incredibly courageous the Ukrainians are. Yes, that is true. But courage is also built with having enough firepower to make this all happen. And that's where other countries come in to help here.
This has been fantastic. I'm always searching for a title. What title do you think captures this conversation?
How about, to me, this is about how cybersecurity, national security, and warfare are evolving as technology and AI changes the playing field. Like, I think that's, it may make that so much tighter, but essentially you've got this moment, and I think AI, when you really boil it down, stands for modernization. It's all these different ways, right? You can think of it as a metaphor for electricity. It's changing how we do all these things. You can think of sort of the social aspects around AI. You can think of it in all these different ways, but AI is shorthand for modernization in all these different settings. And the place where this is playing out, where I live and where our discussion went, is in espionage, in intelligence, on networks, and then in warfare. And those are the domains and the disciplines that are getting so quickly affected by AI from the defender and the offender side that you've got to keep teasing out these big questions. And I think the reason you're, so engaging on this as a listener and a questioner and as a media professional is you see the enduring philosophical and very human questions around how this all evolves. So, and I think those are the right questions to ask because people get so hung up in all of the different ins and outs of what's happened technologically. At the end of the day, though, how are we using this as people? What are we doing as a country?
I do want to, I live in Atlanta and I feel like taking action right now. And you know what? I think maybe I will and find out who the key players are in the water system of the city of Atlanta and just ask them, tell them who I am, tell them who, what I've been looking into and ask them, what is your plan? What is your backup? And maybe we can figure out, you're a consultant for hire. Maybe we can get working on one big water system in a city in the United States.
Ask Atlanta. I am sure, and I hope, and I think it's a good litmus test, a lot of the CISA advisories that have gone out in this administration since the war in Iran are on water systems. And if they're not tracking on that, how has the war in Iran impacted you, Atlanta water, is to me a fascinating question to see what answer you get.
I'm going to be asking that question. I will let you know what the answer is. Laura Galante, thank you so much for joining me for this Wavemaker conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was really a pleasure.